Hello everybody, I hope you've all been staying safe and healthy and self-isolating as much as possible. I know it is a bit of a trying and tiring time at the moment, but if there is a silver lining, we do get to play a lot of video games at the moment. And I have been very busy the last couple of weeks. You may have seen my videos of Final Fantasy VII Remake pop up. You may have read my review of Resident Evil 3 Remake. They've been the two really big ones I've played. I've also had a lot of little stuff to play, like Disaster Report, which I absolutely loved. And there is a game that I haven't covered for the site called AFL Evolution, which is a sports game, and won't mean much to most of the watchers here, but as a big fan of Australian rules football, it was kind of a given that I was going to buy that. A lot of these games have been released a little bit early. Final Fantasy VII, for example, Square Enix let drop in Australia in particular about a week and a half before its official release date, and you get the sense that this is the publishers trying to get these kind of last games out the door before COVID-19 really shuts things down. We've already seen that Sony has announced that The Last of Us 2 has been delayed indefinitely, as well as that Iron Man VR game. We've seen that Japan's Sero ratings board has disbanded temporarily, which means that no new games will be rated for release in Japan, and that's going to put every game that's been made in Japan back at least a month, if not longer, before they'll be able to get it re-rated and set a new release date for it. So there is the sense that going forward things are going to get quite quiet in terms of new releases, except for the indie stuff that kind of pops up on the stores. And I am doing this video on one indie game that is really noteworthy and has just released, so you may have a look at with all the big stuff that's been released right now, but definitely keep this one in the back of your mind because you may well want to come back to it. It's called Curious Expedition. It has been around for quite a while on Steam. It was released back in 2016 and has been a bit of a darling there. It has 2,280 reviews with an average rating of 9 out of 10. It is now on console. You can get it on PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and I believe Xbox. And that is the version that I am looking at here. Did not know that this game existed until I saw it on the stores, but as a fan of roguelikes, as a fan of that kind of strategy game experience that this thing promised, and as a fan of hexes, I picked it up pretty much immediately. You'll see in the overworld shortly there is hexes everywhere and it looks like a board game, and I do love my board games. So aesthetically it was really appealing to me. Even though it doesn't look much, it looks like it's a very indie game wearing its indiness on its sleeve. It has an aesthetic that really appealed to me, and luckily for me, the game itself backs it up. I have really enjoyed my time with this one so far, and I am looking forward to spending a lot more time with it going forwards. So what is Curious Expedition? It is fairly lengthy to explain what actually goes on in this game, but I'll start by saying that it is a roguelike, like I mentioned earlier. Every time that you go on an expedition, the land will be randomly generated, but the same basic elements will appear each time. There will be villages to stay at, there will be shrines to explore, there will be random events and sometimes wild animals or enemies to fight. And then there will be the Golden Pyramid, which is the ultimate goal each time. You want to try and find that and track that down. So to start by describing the villages are kind of the rest stop within the game. As you'll see on the screen there's a purple meter at the top which represents your team's sanity, which is basically its health. Every time you spend a day outside of a safe spot like a village, that sanity starts to drop down. When it gets to 0, bad things can happen, like really bad things. The first time I played, I let the sanity drop to 0, and then one of the people in my expedition turned into a cannibal and ate another one, which was a pretty dramatic end to that expedition. I didn't get much further after that because you really kind of need every single person to stay healthy and sane. There are more minor effects, like for example a party member might accidentally get themselves injured or something. Generally speaking though, you definitely want that purple thing to stay as full as possible. So you'll go off in a direction for a certain number of in-game days, you'll try and explore some points, and then you'll try and go back to the village. What complicates that a little bit is that the villagers have this reputation with you, this system, and if the village doesn't like you, you won't be able to stay there, if not something worse happening. And that reputation kind of drops with every day that you stay at the village. How you can maintain the reputation is to give them stuff, basically, whether that's loot that you find while you're out and about, or things like chocolates and material goods that you've brought with your expedition. Those tend to go down quite well with a village as well. So that's the villages. Then there's the shrines to explore. So they're dotted across the map, and within each shrine is some really valuable loot. If you take that loot back with you to Europe, then you'll get quite a lot of fame and points as a result, and I'll explain those point systems soon enough. But unfortunately, if you do that, the shrine will erupt in some way, whether it's an actual volcano, whether it floods, whether it sends the entire area around you into a kind of a desert environment instead of whatever lush jungle you were previously exploring. Basically, you get karmed. And that also affects the relationship you have with the villagers. If you steal anything from a shrine, you can kiss goodbye to any chance of having a good relationship with the villagers. So really, if you're going to do that, that needs to happen towards the end of the expedition, when you know where the Golden Pyramid is. So the Golden Pyramid, if you get to that, then you automatically succeed in the mission, and you get a huge number of points, and the expedition goes back to England, Europe. Finally, there are the animals to fight, and the combat system is a dice-based combat system where you need to make kind of sets of dice to do certain attacks or certain defensive maneuvers. And to roll those dice, this is a complex system. It only really works once you actually start to play with it. But to roll the dice, you need to have a wide variety of different animals and heroes in your party, as well as preferably things like ammunition and stuff to carry along as well. Why you're doing all of this is because you're in a race with a couple of other players or expeditions to explore as much of the world as possible over the course of 5 or 6, I think it's 5, perhaps 5, 6, whatever. Over a number of expeditions, you need to find as many of these Golden Pyramids as possible and bring back as much loot as you can. After every expedition, the points are tallied, and the one who has the most points at the very end of the game is declared the winner. So it's a bit like a board game in that sense. And if you don't find the Golden Pyramid, you don't tend to get too many points. So you can abandon your expeditions early, but that will set you back in the rankings, of course. If you push on, or try to push on, and your entire party dies, then it's game over. So there's quite a lot of risk reward going on, and in fact that's probably the main element of Curious Expedition. You're constantly balancing out what you should be doing, or what is the ideal to do, versus the consequences of doing so. So do you push on to try and find that Golden Pyramid, risking the sanity and health and life of your party, or do you play it safe and go back and hopefully have an easier time with the next expedition? It also works for inventories. You're very limited in terms of what you can actually fit in your inventory, and if you go overweight or over limit, the sanity of your party drops off really fast after that. So you want to leave some slots open for treasures and things that you find on the expeditions, but at the same time you need to make sure that you've got water. Ideally you should have some chocolate or rum, which restores some sanity while you're out in the field, and of course weapons and equipment to deal with the various hazards that you come across. So for example, if you have a machete, you can cut through the forest, which means that the cost of moving through a forest is less on your sanity. But of course you're not going to have room in your party to carry everything, so you need to try and understand the lay of the land, what to expect, and what to bring along in kind. Now, if all of that sounds complicated, this game does take a little while to get a feel for and get a hang of, and for about the first half dozen or so expeditions, I actually found myself dying within the first 2 or 3. I'm actually showing you footage of one of the first failed expeditions that I undertook with this video. You'll see that I've made the Golden Pyramid here, which is my first expedition, which is great, and I end up with a lot of points, and I'm sitting pretty at the top of the table. But in the next one I go to Greenland or the Arctic, and it all goes very badly for me, and I died within this, without escaping that one. So yeah, failure is quite common at the start, and I guess with most roguelikes, the challenge level is deliberately high, because overcoming that challenge by repetition is really kind of the point of the game. But this game also has the systems, the way the systems all work with one another is quite interlocked and quite, initially it's quite obtuse. So I do recommend not giving up on this within the first couple of plays if you do find it to be a bit of a challenge. It will click with you, I promise. It just takes a little while. Perhaps the best part about this game, beyond the challenge of making it through and kind of winning it as a board game, is also the storytelling that it has. And it has some really compelling moments that really do set a great scene about exploration and really do have that intensity about the dangers involved in doing so. So even though it is a roguelike and therefore there is some randomization built into it, and you might encounter the same stories from one playthrough to the next too often because there might not be enough of them in the actual kind of bank for the game to draw on, they do each have, they're always appropriate to what you're doing. So for example, this one here, I'm at an abandoned station in the Arctic, and it has a very different story to the kind of the village rest stops that I come across while I'm exploring Africa or Asia or whatever. And each time there's a sense of character to them. There's the words, I mean, I don't really pay attention to the graphics because they're quite simple, even though they do set a tone in themselves, but the words that are used, the way that they're written is really interesting stuff. So yeah, and the decisions that you make through the stories actually feel quite important. It's not just about whether you steal the treasure from a shrine and then melt half the continent with after the gods smite you for it, but also the kind of the small decisions that you have to make while at the rest stop, like whether you give a girl a hug when she comes up to you because it's a friendly tribe but she has a rash on her and you're not sure whether you should trust whether you're risking your health to hug her. But of course if you don't, you run the risk of upsetting the tribe. Those little moment-to-moment decisions that you need to make are really impressive bits of kind of emergent writing. And I think the main thing about this game, and I think the reason that people love it as much as they do, is that it is very emergent storytelling driven. Every time you play, you're going to have some kind of different experience, and you're going to remember your favorite expeditions, you're going to remember your favorite efforts, and even your favorite deaths. There are some really memorable moments where you'll do something absolutely stupid and you will remember that one for the next time, not just because it's a mistake you won't repeat, but also because it just has this great kind of story wrapped into it. It helps, of course, that each of the expeditions are actually led by real world names from history. They don't really have a role to play within the story. So for example, if you choose Madame Curie, for example, her real world personality doesn't really come through the game, but there is that just association with the real world through the names, the name dropping as such, which again helps with the emergent storytelling, and it really is a lot of fun in that respect. The other thing that I find really interesting about the game is the way that it addresses some of the themes that it has baked in under the surface. I wouldn't say that Curious Expedition is over the top or particularly heavy-handed about its themes, but they are certainly there in that the game wants to encourage you to have a think about the role of colonialism and how these explorers and what came afterwards really did kind of plunder Asia, Africa, South America, and other parts of the world. So basically, you are encouraged to look at everything as kind of a looting opportunity. You come across the shrine and there are those precious artifacts there. They're worth a lot, so the temptation is really there to steal them, and while the gods might smite you afterwards, the risk reward is very much heavily weighted towards you being able to make an escape. If a volcano erupts after you steal those treasures, the chances are you're still going to be able to move faster than the volcano can expand. So the only other risk is that the villagers won't like you anymore and you lose your ability to rest at their village. But if you time it right and you do make the steal when you already know where the Golden Pyramid is, the expedition ends when you get to the Golden Pyramid, and therefore there is no consequence to stealing those treasures. And that is certainly the way that the game wants you to look at it. It's certainly a deliberate design element from the developers to encourage you to look at everything as a resource, to plunder it, and to not have to face consequences afterwards. Once you get back to Europe, even if those villagers hate you, they're not going to be part of the game anymore for you. even if you've changed the landscape completely by flooding an area because you've stolen all the loot, you don't have to go back there again. You're off to a different location with your next expedition. So you never have to deal with the consequences, which is again kind of the problem with colonial Europe back in those days. Now each individual game of Curious Expedition runs for about an hour, with each expedition taking about 10 minutes to get to the end or die trying. So yeah, like I said, because there's 5 or 6 expeditions in a single game, you're looking at about an hour or less if you die early. But there's an awful lot of replay value that is really baked into the experience. There is different locations to visit, there are different characters to choose, each character has different equipment and different abilities, so the game does change up each time, and you will still come across new story elements quite late into the game because of the nature of randomization. There will be some that you don't experience until quite deep into the thing. So yeah, there's plenty of replay value in here. I am a little bit surprised that there isn't a multiplayer mode. I actually would have thought that multiplayer would fit with this game particularly well, because it is kind of asynchronous, and because the competitive board game like nature of it would have made for an interesting dynamic. The AI in this game is fairly predictable in terms of the results they'll get from their own expeditions, so even before you set out, you'll know roughly how many points you need to get in order to stay on top, whereas when you play against other human players, you would have such a range of things to deal with, and they might have an incredible run followed by a terrible run, so there would be a greater sense of that risk reward would be built in if there was human people to play against, because they're less predictable. That being said, because it is a first outing for the developers, I think it's a really great effort, and as I've managed to do a 17-minute video so far on it, I think that there's a lot of positives that you could take out of Curious Expedition. It's certainly one that I highly recommend. The good news is that there's actually another one coming, and if you do have a PC, you can actually get the demo for Curious Expedition 2 right now. That will be cool. I'll definitely be sure to check that out. This thing looks like it'll run on pretty much any PC, and yeah, my PC will certainly be up to it, so I will make sure that I check the sequel out well before the console release this time around. Like I said at the start of the video, I never even knew this existed until I started to play it, but it's definitely my kind of game. And just to finish off, you're about to see me get slaughtered by a bunch of polar bears. I do find the combat in this game to be quite obscure, and I still don't think I'm entirely comfortable with it. Even after I've played so many games of it, I try to avoid combat wherever possible, and that's probably my downfall, because it means that my parties are never built around combat. But generally speaking, if I get into a fight, I'm going to lose it. But it is one thing that I would hope to see fixed in the sequel. It's not that the actual idea of doing dices and combinations is poor, it's just I think it's poorly communicated, and it's a little bit hard to kind of get a feel for the particular tactics you need to use, the kind of dice that you need to get. Like there's this Yahtzee system where you can re-roll dice, but I'm still not entirely sure I understand the right conditions under which I would want to re-roll dice rather than just use the ones I've got, and it goes on and on. It's the one thing that I can say is a down point to this game, so if you do go into it expecting some kind of combat heavy game, I suggest you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed, because this is certainly a secondary thing to the rest of the game. It is something I think they can easily fix though, so I would expect that Curious Expedition 2 will do a better job of it. Anyway, I really have rambled on long enough about this game. Thanks for tuning in if you have got to this point. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. I'll do a lot more of them, I promise. And if you back me on Patreon, you'll be my best friend, because yeah, I don't do advertising, so Patreon backing is pretty much the way you can support me if you enjoy my videos. Thanks as always for watching, and we will see you at the next one.